Welcome back to the Business Roundtable Podcast. My name is David Carr, host and your leader, founder of the podcast, a founder of Steward Your Business, where I bring people together to accomplish great things. And today we're going to have a great new guest on the podcast. And before we do that, I just thought I'd give you guys a little hook here, if you will. What are we actually going to talk about? Well, most business owners, when they think about HR, they're thinking about payroll, policies, hiring, firing, things of that nature. Well, I'm excited to bring to you a brand new guest here, Bruce Nichols, a global HR executive. He is really a talent and culture specialist, strategist, actually. And I'm super excited to have here on the podcast, Bruce. Welcome to the Business Roundtable.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have this conversation. This is a great topic for me and excited to dig into it.
Absolutely. No, it's super exciting. So when you and I met not too long ago, we were talking part of Success Champions Network, and what I really liked when you and I were talking, Bruce, and why I wanted to have you on the podcast is that you said, you know what, HR really think of it as a profit multiplier, a growth engine. And I thought, wow, a lot of people don't think about HR that way. And I don't think they think about it as strategically as you and I were talking about. And that's why I was really excited to have you come on here, Bruce. But before we get into the meat of it, I want people to understand a little bit more about your background, how you got to the Human Resource Consortium, and what you're doing today. So take us back a little bit, your journey as a business owner and founder of your company now, where you're at.
Yeah, I know. I would say I had a long and storied career in HR, but I would say the story part is more would take us forever to get into. But really my whole career after leaving the Army I was in finance for a little while. I got into human resources. I think a lot of people would say by mistake. It just sort of fell on my lap. As I was kind of growing up through my career, I made a few pivots thinking that, well, this is going to be my operational move. I'm going to get into this call center job. I'm going to go do something different. I'm going to work in retail. And it never really worked out for me. I always got pulled back in. And what I finally realized as I was navigating through my career and when I went out on my own some time ago was I think there's getting into HR for me was more than just, the hiring, the firing, the onboarding, the recruitment, the payroll.
Yep.
It really came down to managing and leading people and helping business owners, business leaders really make good decisions around their people, how they were working with them from a culture perspective, and putting that right person in the right space at that time to help grow your business. And that's, to me, it's fascinating. That's really where the work of HR and the business, meets.
Yeah, well, that's exactly why I wanted you to have you on here, because Bruce, as Steward Your Business, I'm helping develop people, but you have to have. I love coming in working folks like yourself, Bruce, because you have this overarching strategy and you're working with the team, and it's so important. I can only do so much if there's not alignment with the overall strategy and how we're going to leverage all this expertise, and particularly nowadays with technology and things coming in there. But one of the things I was for me, if you don't mind, Bruce, because I thought it was a great story about where you came through and you said kind of the, what the heck moment, like if you will, about where you saw people in the wrong seats. Yeah. And how, I love that experience, that story that you shared with me. If you mind share with our listeners, like what you saw walking around out there in construction and whatnot, and where you're like, oh my goodness, there's something wrong here.
Yeah. So I had a great friend. I've known him for a long time. And he was running a construction company, and he really was looking to go from that $2 to $3, $5 million mark up to the $10 or $12 million mark, and then on and beyond, and attract venture capital, maybe a private equity buyer, trying to really grow his business and boost it to a point where he could sit back and operate as a CEO, and then maybe even retire. But when we sat back and we looked at this, we were constantly in this stage of crisis or priorities, and nothing was working. And I just remember sitting out one morning in the bays, watching him deploy trucks on different jobs, and he's checking a manifest, and he's looking at these lists, and he's getting the crews ready, and he's barking orders. And I said something like, where the heck's your ops guy? I know you hired somebody. We talked about this. What is he doing? Why are you out here doing this instead of talking to that customer that had just had that major flood damage and needs renovation done? You should be doing. And the aha moment really was for him. Was like, I don't know. He's in the office doing his operation stuff. I'm like, no, he should be out here doing his operation stuff, barking orders, loading trucks, checking people. And I said, if he's not doing this, your leaders or your supervisors, your shit crew guys aren't going out there learning anything either. You don't have the right person in the right seat. Do not have that right thing. And what we found was he had to make a tough decision. He had to move that person out of that job, eliminate that role, and he had to bring in somebody that really was an operations COO type, like go out there, crunch the numbers, run the crew, check the manifest, and then develop the supervisors who are managing each one of these crews and making sure that they knew, here's the job order, here's what goes with this job, here's the equipment you need, here's the people assigned. They should be showing up with all that knowledge. And if you're not spending time developing them, you're wasting all this time and you should be growing revenue. And almost overnight, what ended up happening was he made those choices. He developed a team. He invested in some really good shift supervisors to get out to the job sites. And within just a few years, his revenue almost doubled. And that's because he was focused on the next job and he didn't have to worry about that day to day.
That's fantastic. And I love that, Bruce, because I've been there myself in that same place, the company I was with previously, building that team and getting to that place where it can sustain itself. And it's not like the business owner has having to put all these fires out, but finding the right people and coming up with a strategy. And like you said, you ask them the good questions, Bruce, which I think any good consultant, with their salt, then you're asking the questions like, why are you doing this? Holding up that mirror and in a way of helping them move forward with their business. And that's just a great success story there, Bruce. Why do you feel, because I don't think sometimes business owners don't even realize, obviously he did, and they're bleeding profit because of these decisions with people, if you will. I'm going to say there's a money gap, or however you want to say it, but there's this place. Why do you think that is? What is it about the business owner that he didn't obviously see it, but you came in and you saw it right away. You were like, it was like kind of plain as day to you.
Yeah, and it's funny. This conversation isn't unique to the entrepreneur, the small company owner, or somebody running anything from an HVAC to a managed service provider, technology shop. It's very similar where they come up to the ranks. They're good at what they do. They understand the business. They can swing a hammer. They can run a server. They can write code. Whatever it is they're doing, they know it. And then at some point, they have to step back and trust somebody to come in and do it with them or for them.
Yep.
And then they actually, so building that trust and confidence, but then they actually have to learn how to grow and run the business and not let the business run them. And a lot of times what they're looking for from an HR person is like, let's make sure they get paid. Let's make sure they get benefits. Let's make sure we're compliant. And if the Department of Labor comes in, we don't want to have any findings. Well, that's all fine and good. Like that's important. We need to do that. But we also, from an HR perspective, we should be having that conversation like answering all those whys with you. So if that conversation at the Fortune 100 level was, you've got a good team of people around you, let's develop trust, let's develop the skill sets, let's make sure that these guys can step into your role, or they can step into the next level of leadership so they can run their shop. Yeah. It's the exact same conversation you have with an entrepreneur that has, just started up and is just decided, I'm going to open up this, I'm going to do this service, and I'm going to run my business, and because I'm good. That's a gap. We need to change it from managing the business to leading the business to being a CEO and leading your people.
Yeah. Do you think, this is so important. Again, Bruce, what you're talking about, what I hear is that there's this lack of strategic thinking, and you're like, well, I got this far, but what got you this far is not going to get you to that next part of the journey. And I see what I hear you saying, Bruce, is like, you're somebody that comes in and says, okay, looking at all these things, and like the gentleman you talked about previously, he said, hey, I had this guy there, he didn't have the right skill set. We had to move him around. We had to get some right people in the place. So, talk to me a little bit about how, when you come in and engage with a business owner and how do you start to unravel that, Bruce? How do you identify the places where they're losing money, if you will? And that's not necessarily because of sales, it's because of the structure that they have or the timing of the people. How do you go in there and start to pull that apart, Bruce?
So some people think it's like some magic sauce or some crazy solution to this, but really is sometimes it's just listening. It's having the active listening skills. And, what a lot of people from an HR perspective need to start developing is a strong acumen, financial and or just general business acumen, so that they can have those conversations. I spoke with a tech services provider a few weeks back, and it was just understanding what he did and how he did it, and having a little bit of knowledge about cybersecurity, having a little bit of knowledge about what it takes to move from into data, or move from like a tech service provider and adding in seats and adding in users, and just having a general conversation about where he wants his business to go. And for me, when I sat back and listened, I was like, okay, he's got a lot of things happening. So the next step is this: he needs to grow. Growth means that you have to add people. It means that you have to understand some basic mechanics, some basic financial statements. Maybe you have to understand what the revenue stream is. How do they make money? And having that skill to just listen and ask follow-up questions and just picking it apart from there is critical for an HR person now. Like the role's evolving.
Oh yeah, definitely. I hear that for sure, Bruce. And I think I've been following enough with AI technology. How do we upskill our team? We don't want to necessarily just let I think this is a meat to me, Bruce. I love your perspective. I think it's a short-sighted move just to say, oh, well, we've got AI, let's just take out these people and let's just replace it with AI. I think that's a short-sighted and fraught with danger. What are your thoughts there? I'm just curious. You're seeing some people say, well, we don't need these people anymore.
Yeah, I'm a people first strategist, and in the age of AI, that can be a little bit wonky and I think a little risky to say. But if you take that human centric, that people first strategy, and sometimes I'll even say keep the H in human resources, like keep the human in HR.
Yeah.
And we're so quick to say, like, we need to save money, we need to get efficiency, we're going to put this technology in. It doesn't necessarily it's not just AI, but any technology, and it's going to make it more efficient, faster, it's going to make it slick, and we're going to save money. But the underlying process has to be right. And that's where we miss the boat, is that when we sit back and we look at how the nuts and bolts come together, and we know that the process is right, then implement technology, put the AI on top of it. And I've seen in a few places where we've implemented AI, especially in the call center environment, it's so quick to just like, we'll have, the basic queries come in, we'll type in, they'll type in these questions, the answer will be spit out, and it'll be great. And then all of a sudden we're on the back end looking at it going, how come it's all wrong? People aren't satisfied. Customer satisfaction is not good. They don't like the UX, UI experience. And it's because the underlying process wasn't right to begin with. So if you really want to implement an AI, really thinking about fixing what your core systems are, what your core process is the first step.
Yeah.
And then the future.
So one thing I wanted to ask Bruce of you, since you're so strategically oriented, and I appreciate this very much. One of the things I struggled with as a project manager, group manager at the time, this is a previously company, I would like to know your thoughts on this, is like, when you're talking about growth, right? Like walking through the business owner or those leaders of like, what does that mean when I'm saying I'm going to add 10, 20, 50 people to my team? I don't think they don't understand. You walk them through like, what are the ramifications? There's obviously good things because you can do the math and say, for each person I bring in full-time equivalent, it generates this. But there's also cost and time and energy as well. How do you walk them through that, Bruce? Of like what's involved?
Well, it's such an interesting question because the one thing that I'm really starting to look at right now, especially with analytics and the predictive analytics side of HR, is can you get a return on investment for people? Or and what that means is, what does the revenue per person look like? So if you're in, a certain call center or a sales environment or service related industry or whatever that is, and you're going to add a person, that automatically, that partnership with the CFO is critical, because then you start thinking, okay, I'm going to bring this person in and they're going to be able to provide this level of service. And what it looks like to me is having that conversation is I'm hearing 30 to 50 to 100 people, and this is what we're going to look like. When do you going to start? What is it going to look like when you start bringing these people in? What is your onboarding plan? What does the development look like? What does it look like, not just on that return or that revenue per person, but what does that ramp up time look like prior to revenue? What's that cost of onboarding? And then you start getting into some real serious numbers, because you might need, in certain environments and certain industries, an extended period of time. Maybe there's licensing involved, maybe, in the medical field for sure, where they just need to come in and there's a regulatory requirement, they need to be onboarded, and then they start earning revenue. And so I always kind of start the conversation with, okay, by when, what is the drop dead date? When do you want to have these 30 people in place, and why? And then let's start going backwards from there. Let's back in the Army, we used to say backward planning, because we would just look at the goal and say, like, what's all the steps, when we get to that final goal, what's that next first stage look up when we back up, and keep backing up. And I think a lot of times we don't realize that this time next year, you want to have 30 people in place. We may need to start having this conversation now, what that ramp up time looks like. So when we pull the trigger and we start the recruiting process, and then we onboard, and for every single person, every person that we're going to bring on, we're probably going to have 2 or 3 interviews. And what is that? So you really have to have a really deep conversation about what that process is. And we're so quick to say, well, we're going to have a technology solution and some applicant tracking system is going to fix all this and make it easy. It's not. It's going to make it more cumbersome if the process isn't right.
Right. So breaking down that process, Bruce, because I think sometimes, I remember being that person that was like, okay, we got resumes coming in, and by the way, you got to squeeze in these interviews with everything else you're going on. It wasn't planned. It was like, how am I going to do this with everything else I've got on? I've also got employee reviews and other things, and I don't think they thought the ramifications of, to your point, Bruce, too, of like, there's a ramp up time too. This is something I had to learn, of like, your capacity is decreased in the short term when you're bringing on a bunch of different people, because now you can try to minimize it, but I've never found, like, it's not like you have a slowdown and you got to get everybody up to speed, right? And thinking about that.
Yeah, it's so important. And I can't stress enough with, a lot of times with business owners or leaders that say, well, I need this now. Well, if you need it now, calling Bruce isn't going to be helpful, because Bruce is going to tell you, you should have called me 6 months ago. And I maybe I can help you, but it's not going to be now. It's going to be 3 to 4 more months.
Well, that's a great point too, Bruce, of the companies that are being proactive in this. Maybe contrast a little bit more. The companies that are working on this on a, month by month, quarter by quarter, they're evaluating these things, versus the companies, like you were saying, Bruce, that are like, not being proactive in this. It comes to mind. I was working with a company, years ago, and they were about 5,000-6,000 employees. And for whatever reason, I can't remember the exact story, Bruce, but they would always historically recruit college, graduates. And for some reason, they just said, we don't need to do that. They delayed, and it didn't show up for about a year later. They did paused on it, and then they're like, oh my goodness, we don't have stuff in our pipeline. We have all this work coming in, and we weren't just proactive. So it took them months to get back, to untangle that, but they didn't realize somebody paused it, put the brake on it. They said, hey, it's not so important right now, but it didn't show up immediately. It took a while. There was a lag there.
Yeah. So with some organizations, what I've worked with them on is flexible hiring plans and staffing, meaning that, there's probably a core group that would sustain you over peak or periods or slowdowns where, work has to get done and there's going to be a steady stream of need. And then when you back that off, there's probably ways to think about your workforce where maybe the mix is 70-30 or your 60-40, where you probably need, 20, 30, 40% of your workforce to be contingent. And that using that pipeline. I know a lot of companies think that way, and they also like college hiring, new hire programs, and having a bench of new talent that's just coming into the organization. A lot of large companies will do that, and they started, over the past few years, I've seen a lot of companies slow down in that hiring, and then turn around and say, "Oh, crap! Where are we now?" And kind of not having that 2 to 3 year view. Now, planning HR and planning people for 2 to 3 years out is incredibly difficult. And I think that's where the evolution of HR is starting to go, is like really getting into the analytics of it and looking at business trends and looking at the economy, inward and outward market, economic pressures, whatever that is. And knowing that at certain points, there are going to be upticks and downticks in your business, but you need to have a steady staffing model or plan of what it looks like. And if your intent is to grow, then you need to have a certain percentage of people coming into your organization, not just to replace those that are leaving, but to supplement and to grow the business and pick up that work, so you can then have that internal move of talent. And that comes down to really being able to sit down with owners and having a talent plan or strategy. It's beyond just succession. It's really doing that deep dive levels down into the organization and saying, this is who I have on my team. This is who has potential to move on. This is who needs extra help, and do we need to invest in these folks to give them the extra help or not? What decision do we need to make? And having that really descriptive, in-depth conversation.
That's a great, I appreciate that, Bruce. I think, and there's changing things out there in the marketplace. So for those that are maybe more entry-level hires, let's just say I'm here in Southern California, where the minimum wage keeps going up. So I know, the fast food and everything. So then, if people don't realize that it affects other places, because you're like, hey, you're somebody that could go make money in this area, and you're like trying to compete with the same pool of people, if you will, or at least they're comparing. Talk a little bit about those changing economics and things where they're at, about things that business owners need to look at when they're looking at compensation and trying to attract key people. Yeah,
compensation is so tricky. And so the minimum hourly wage discussion is so interesting and complex, and so staying out of the political side of this, but when you start getting into, here's the baseline and you have to pay this, you kind of take away that competitive nature of the marketplace a little bit. That being said, we are confronted with an increasingly more expensive workforce. Inflationary rates, pay rates, whatever you want to call it, they are going to continue to rise. So thinking about that from, I think where, I spend a lot of time is just trying to help businesses understand what their marketplace is locally, and then trying to, see what their economic pressures are as they start broadening out their footprint. And I'll give you an example of working with a technology company in the Boston market. We were looking at software engineering wages. And for this company, they were competitive for the national market, but they weren't competitive for the Boston market. And then they had a team in Seattle, and they were even less competitive. And when you started, but when you looked at their pay rates, they could have paid that number in New Hampshire, Ohio, Texas, wherever they were, and it would have been more than competitive. So the dynamics of hiring people and then deciding, okay, do we need to hire people Boston? Should we be more remote? Should we have a different strategy on hiring? And what we started seeing is that in certain markets, people were going across the street from our shop to a startup or to another newer technology that was being popped up, and they were getting sometimes double the salary.
Wow.
And they were young. Like, these are, I say kids, but they were, 2 to 3 years out of school. And the wages were phenomenally high. 2 to 3 years later, they would call back saying, well, that doesn't exist anymore. Can I come home? And we sometimes we'd have to say, no, you were not for that, for what you were. Plus, we'll give you a bump up because you've been 2 more years of experience. What we ended up doing is really having to adjust wages locally in Boston and Seattle to make them more competitive in that marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the time, just in that Boston marketplace, you go 20 minutes outside of Boston, and there were 15, 20,000 technology jobs, software engineering jobs in that market. And now, obviously, it's declined recently, and it's probably not as competitive, but the wages are still there. They haven't come down. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but some of that is just being able to sit back with these business leaders, these finance leaders in the business and say, okay, here's the impact. Here's what it looks like, and here's why we need to make an adjustment. In working with the CFOs, especially the finance leaders, and saying, what does it look like if we take everybody in this organization, all let's say 25, and we give them 10% of a
Right.
bump? What does that look like over time? Is 10% in my marketplace, that analysis, 10% wasn't even close. It was like 15 to 20%. But that's the kind of work from an HR perspective that I think we need to get into and be able to have those conversations. And again, when I make these statements, these aren't like large shops, and this is just isn't a large company problem. This is the same conversation you have to be able to have all the way down to the startup level of saying, understand the marketplace, understand competitive wages and the conditions around that, and then dialoguing. You know, I won't have all those answers all the time, but I will have enough knowledge to go find it and bring it back to you so I can have a legitimate, like, sit down and say, this is what I'm seeing and why it's important for you to think about compensation.
Yeah, absolutely, Bruce. I mean, you brought up a couple things that trigger in my mind. So, as you're looking at those things, so important as what's going on in the marketplace. I work particularly with firms in the professional services, architecture, engineering, environmental consulting, construction, the nature, Bruce. In fact, I'm going to be speaking, we're recording this in October. I'm going to be speaking in November 20 next month at a Federal Small Business Conference for Society for Military Engineers. And a lot of these folks are trying to compete in the federal marketplace. They're trying to understand, how can I make myself competitive? But again, they could be drawing from people. When you're talking about the federal marketplace, you could be working people anywhere in across the country, and so it could be working with suppliers. It could be either employees. What does that look like? And like you said, the things are changing, and I've seen this at least from professional services, Bruce, where if they're not engaging somebody like you, working with the COO, the C-suite, the CFO, and we're making decisions on proposals, and particularly sometimes I have multi-year contracts, 3-5 year contracts that you're locking in rates and labor categories. And is that truly sustainable? Or, are you going to be able to find those people at those rates, or are you kind of setting yourself up for some hard times? And I think having somebody like you, Bruce, kind of, at least, I mean, you don't have a crystal ball, but at least you have trends. You can, like you said, find this research and give them a better understanding and how to make some informed decisions here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a human resources perspective, we don't always have all the answers, but we should have the knowledge of the marketplace and enough acumen to be able to sit down with any business leader and have a conversation and make a recommendation. And
Mm-hmm.
some of this is really based on how many times we've seen it, because these trends don't just disappear; they come back.
Mm-hmm.
And so over time, being able to say, here's the trajectory we're on and why it's important. And then, in certain fields, like especially in the engineering field, where some of those folks, as they get more educated and more experienced, they get more expensive. And that's the same in any industry. But, some of these specialties shops and specialty fields where, architecture and engineering and building and such, where
Mm-hmm.
you really need to be precise and you've got to follow certain regulatory and health and safety requirements and
Yep.
OSHA regulations. Having groups around you that can understand that and have that conversation is important. But having somebody in your hip pocket that says, not only do I understand the situation we're in, but I understand the dynamics of the people that you're looking for and why it's important to attract the right people. Because eventually if you attract the wrong one, you're just going to blow up whatever it is you're working on. It's going to fall to pieces.
Right. I mean, that's like a tipping time bomb, hiring the wrong person, trying to
Right.
go, all the other problems that come along with that. And for those that are listening in and leaning into this conversation, I definitely want you guys I want to encourage you guys to connect with Bruce. We're connected on LinkedIn and other places. We're going to put in the show notes how you can connect with Bruce. But this is so important what you're doing, Bruce, because I'm so passionate about developing the people, but I love coming and having you on here, this overarching strategy for helping these business owners get out of their own way. And I know we've covered a lot of different things here on the podcast today. I'd love to get your thoughts here. Maybe some actionable items, some things that the business owner can do, can reflect on, Bruce, as they're listening to this. Obviously, we want them to reach out, message Bruce, connect with him. But, if they're kind of like, where do I start, Bruce? What do I look at this? How can I, be a better steward, if you will, of the people that I'm entrusted to, the organization I'm taking care of. Where do I start based on where you're coming from today?
Yeah, it's what a great question. And as you're asking the question, and I knew this was coming, my mind was changing on the fly, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute, there's a great answer. But I think, to me, the starting point is objectivity and just being able to like sit back and look in the mirror. What I used to tell a lot of folks, or some of the leaders I work with, is let's just sit down and with somebody that is objective enough to give you an honest opinion and dialogue. Let's just chat. Let's just talk about what it is you're going to do and why it's important. That's the starting point. I would love to say, like, you should call somebody like me or call me directly. I'll help you out. I'm not a business development, a sales guy. I try to pretend to be one sometimes, but to me, like, just pick up the phone or do a video chat, text somebody that you can trust. And I'll give you an example. I had coffee this morning with an old family friend, and he was a senior level guy at a construction company. Went into a new market, new area, and we were just going back and forth on, family, friends, what he wants to do, where he's going. And we got into the business side of things. And when we finally got done, we were mapping out a plan for commercial real estate, and we were mapping out a plan for business development on my business. We were having this great dialogue around surrounding ourselves with people that we knew and trust. And to me, that is so important. Like, surround yourself with the right people that are objective and trustworthy. Everything else will flow from there, because if you can't do that, then there's no point.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad you came on here, Bruce, to share with us today. I hope you guys listened and heard this. I feel like you are a true architect of talent structure and workforce planning and really helping the executives, Bruce. And I think for those that don't have that, or just it's not their skill, or they're not what they're leaning into, Bruce is a person that you've now encountered here on the Business Roundtable podcast and lean that in. I love working and collaborating with you and developing those teams and leaders so that they can execute and communicate, better. Bruce, it's just a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining with us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yes. Thanks for listening, following along. We, of course, love having you guys like and subscribe, wherever you find us on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, whatever the podcast platform it is. Leave any comments you have for us. We'll make sure Bruce gets them as well. Of course, share this with your audience if you found this was helpful and useful, and come back on our next episode of the Business Roundtable podcast. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here with us. Have an amazing day. We'll see you next time.